Good day everyone. Today I'll be addressing the Nigerian problem. So the crux of Nigeria's problem is underdevelopment, which is a consequence of corruption and distributive injustices that are procured by the resource cost or the paradox of plenty. That is in line with the position of resource cost theorists that have diagnosed that pathology in countries that are simultaneously resource rich and extremely poor. So Nigeria falls into the category of countries suffering from the resource cost because the country has petroleum and gold, which is sufficient to achieve high levels of development. For example, Qatar is a country that was developed primarily through the trade of petroleum resources because the government had the political will to facilitate national development. Now, moving back to Nigeria, it's obvious that the economic plight of the Federal Republic of Nigeria are protracted in the sense that they didn't start today. The Nigerian problem is a ramification of long-term inter-administrative vices and malpractices that have been perseverated or sustained by the combined efforts of internal as well as external actors. These problems did not start in 1960, and they did not also end at the beginning of the Fourth Republic in 1999. They are still with us, and the situation appears to be deteriorating progressively, especially judging from the ramifications of the economic policies implemented by this incumbent APC regime. Now, I don't want to give a myopic assessment of the situation because I think the most prudent way to approach this Nigerian economic dilemma is to judge Nigeria's situation in the context of the global value chain. So based on that approach, it's important to adopt a historical methodology as a means of assessing where we are coming from, our current situation, and where we are probably heading to as a country. Now, when speaking of development at the national level, the linchpin of the discussion, that is the most crucial topic of interest in regard to national development, is always industrialization. So if you are speaking of industrialization, that historically takes us back to the first industrial revolution, which also occurred simultaneously with the era of enlightenment. New levels of development and economic progress are galvanized by higher levels of education and information. Thus, every innovation is a consequence of man's understanding of the world, its problems, and how such problems can be solved. So that leads us to the question of why is Nigeria underdeveloped? So my opinion is that the best way to understand Nigeria's economic situation is to assess it in the context of the global value chain, as I've already mentioned. Now, adopting that methodology, a very important question is, during the first industrial revolution, what were countries doing to industrialize and improve their economies? That is an important question because the answer to that question correlatively explains or reveals the inexorable route which developed countries applied to achieve high levels of development. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the year 760. Thus, in order to join the wave of industrialization, countries like the United States of America, France, Belgium, and Germany adopted various strategies and economic policies, in order to ride this new wave of industrialization that began in the 1760s. Through various strategies and economic policies like technology transfer, labor migration, establishment of technical schools, the implementation of protectionist policies for aiding the growth of local infant industries, among other policies and strategies implemented for the purpose of achieving horizontal economic integration so that their countries can also trade with other industrialized countries on a level playing field as producers of industrial commodities that will be of value to other countries so they can horizontally integrate themselves into the global value chain as producers of industrial products and get rich as a consequence of trading. That's just the basis of these strategies adopted by countries like USA, France, Belgium, Germany and others to become as industrialized as England at the time, where the first industrial revolution began in the 1760s. So now coming back to Nigeria, the question is, during this period of the first industrial revolution, when countries were striving to have industrial economies, in regard to Nigeria, the question is, what was happening to the country within this era of the first industrial revolution? And the answer to that question is, Nigeria was under the imperialistic control of Britain. During the first industrial revolution, British imperialists implemented colonial policies in all African colonies including Nigeria. The strategy was the same: to undermine industrialization while focusing on vertical economic integration by designing African colonies, Nigeria included, to be consumer economies dependent on industrial products produced in the Western world, and also making sure that these colonies focused on the production of primary products and natural resources. And another fact is that industrial education was also suppressed in African colonies. African colonies had no proper educational foundation for industrialization. And remember, I said all these were policies that were intentionally engineered to suppress industrial development in African colonies. Nigeria was a British colony. So British imperialists also created a balance of payment crisis by inflating the cost of imported foreign commodities while correlatively reducing the price of resources and raw materials that were exported from Nigeria to the Western world. So after independence, these were the problems that Nigerian leaders were expected to solve. However, dependency theorists and those that affirm the problem of colonial legacies attest to the existence of an unholy alliance between African post-independence political leaders and the compadre bourgeoisie, that is, economic imperialists, guided by the aim of serving foreign economic interests. So using Nigeria for example, that argument is corroborated by the fact that Nigerian leaders have consistently failed to implement the necessary economic reforms required for salvaging the country's economy and for undoing the negative legacies of colonialism that are still bedeviling the country today, as epitomized in the state's failure to adequately fund education. For example, the federal government's investment in education is appallingly low. Nigeria's investment in education is much lower than that of various African countries and many countries in general, including Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Kenya, Iran, among other countries. And in contrast to the country's investment in education, Nigeria has one of the highest paid politicians in the world. For instance, some years back, reports verified that the salaries and allowances of Nigerian politicians were way more higher than the wages of the President of America, as verified by a report that was released during the tenure of Barack Obama. That is another paradox. Probably one of the poorest countries in the world, with politicians that are paid higher wages than the president of the one of the richest countries in the world. So that is another paradox. Also, a noteworthy issue is the failure of the government to maintain the value of the naira, which is a reality that benefits foreign countries and maintains the economic imbalance that was intentionally engineered by imperialists prior to Nigeria's independence. I've already made mention to the balance of payment crisis during the colonial era, when the price of industrial commodities coming from the west were inflated while the price of primary goods and natural resources exported from Africa were sold at cheap giveaway prices. That is balance of exchange disparity that is also perseverated by current administrations due to their failure to strengthen the country's currency, which makes the Nigerian economy suffer, but it also benefits foreign economies that have stronger currencies in terms of trade and exchange. Another fact that supports the narrative that Nigerian leaders are in cohort with foreign economic imperialists is implied by the decisions of the federal government of various administrations over the years to adopt conditionalities, austerity measures and structural adjustment programs prescribed by Bretton Woods institutions, which are Western dominated institutions, regardless of the negative impact of such policies on the welfare and the development of the country. One example is the structural adjustment program that was initiated by the Babangida regime in court with the International Monetary Fund in 1988, which led to a lot of agitations and protests during that era. So although the view that Nigerian leaders are applying their symbolic power for the purpose of catering to foreign economic interests at the expense of the Nigerian people appears to be kind of a conspiracy theory. However, the problem can also be assessed from another angle. Another angle is the structural perspective. The structural perspective that is emphasized by authors and observers who claim that the creation of artificial borders, for instance, by virtue of the 1914 amalgamation policy that merged culturally heterogeneous regions for the purpose of financial expediency and physical federalism, created a structural problem anchored on the view that federating units which are incapable of coexisting peacefully were arbitrarily merged into a conflict-prone federation, based on the divide and rule strategy. Nigeria is a product of the 1914 amalgamation policy of Sir Frederick Lord Lugard to merge the northern and southern protectorate into one unified country, which is now the Federal Republic of Nigeria. That is the basis of the structural problem. So the structural problem is anchored on the view that heterogeneity procures insecurity and disunity, and meaningful development cannot be achieved without a nationalistic vision for collective development and shared prosperity. So the imperialistically engineered divide and rule strategy is the basis of the argument that Nigeria was built to fail, based on the tendency of rulers as well as the masses to pedestalize sectional loyalties over loyalty to the nation, as a consequence of vices like ethnocentrism and tribalism, and also religious extremism, which are bound to procure conflicts, security crises, distributive injustices, as well as secessionist agitations. That is, agitations to divide the country. For example, the agitations that led to the Nigerian Civil War of 1967. Hence, all these issues, one way or the other, are bound to represent themselves in the political arena, because the political arena is the epicenter of all the problems and crises that are bedeviling the country. That is why I'm saying that the major problem of the country is politics, specifically due to the lack of national identity and lack of loyalty to the nation. As a consequence of that, politics is more centered on primitive accumulation than distributive justice. So the country is dealing with the problem of, or the vice of, primitive accumulation of political power through electoral corruption on the one hand, as well as the kleptocratic accumulation of resources for the purpose of funding electoral corruption. So these are the two vices that inevitably lead to Nigeria's economic decline, underdevelopment, poverty, and low rates of industrialization, based on the lack of political will to develop the country, specifically on the part of the leaders. Because there is a psychological detachment that exists between the leaders, the people, and the country, due to the fact that cronyistic and nepotistic alliances have divorced Nigerians from their country, in a way that the only relationship we have with the country appears to be an exploitative and parasitic one that is primarily characterized by corruption. That is a major reason why the country's economy has been progressively declining over the years. So the nation is becoming more of an illusion than a reality, primarily based on the lack of political will of the ruling class to solve this problem. Due to their lack of political will, instead of acting, some leaders are even more prone to abdicating the blame and the responsibility to the powerless. That is why you can hear quotes like, don't think of what Nigeria can do for you, but think of what you can do for Nigeria. It's a very paradoxical quote. Or the narrative that the nation is poor because youths are lazy. That is another narrative. That is like the powerful are abdicating the blame and the responsibility to the powerless, especially during the last regime. So what is the solution to Nigeria's problem? First of all, I would say we need to separate ourselves from the delusion that Nigeria's problem is an iconoclastic case. Because we will continue chasing shadows until we humble ourselves enough to accept the simplicity of the problem that is procuring a host of complications. The major problem is a leadership crisis, lack of national identity, pedestalization of sectional loyalties over nationalism. And there is only one solution to all leadership problems. Because leadership problems are primarily a consequence of the failure of the government to uphold the social contract. And the social contract is captured in the principle of constitutionalism, which is centered on the establishment of an efficacious frame of government or public administrative system that is aimed at protecting, respecting, and fulfilling the civil, political, and economic rights of citizens. So the first step is by solving the ethical crisis that is bedeviling the country, especially in regard to the political culture of the ruling class. So that is a solution that is captured in the provisions of Section 15 of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which declares that loyalty to the nation shall override all sectional loyalties. That will solve the ethical crisis. Or maybe another solution is to vote Sowore as the president. We are talking of solutions. So I gave two solutions, and that's all, and God bless.